Greetings and welcome to another on-air who knows what, get ready for anything experience. I'm Giles Reeves from SeligAudio, coming at you with too loud music and the wrong title on my live stream. After I hit broadcast or whatever the button is, it went live and I realized I am still calling this September. I will change the name. Sorry for any confusion anybody sees when they're looking at the stream wondering what's going on. First up, the weather here in Connecticut is coming up on fall. Slowly coming up on fall. We're just starting to get some colors, and it looks a little something like this if you're looking out the skylight on a rainy day like 2 days ago. It's nice and sunny now, and it actually got up to 70 degrees, but we're getting down in the 40s Fahrenheit at night. So it's starting to feel like fall, and around the neighborhood there are some amazing colors busting out already. Jumping the gun a little bit. And I'm excited though that anytime there's a change in the weather, it always is exciting. And fall was always my favorite time growing up in the South because it was the end of humidity. Oh my gosh. Anyway, it's pleasant here, a little humid. Doesn't get too humid up here in New England. I am very thankful for that. Today we're doing a deep dive in side chaining. I don't know where it's going to take us. We're about to find out though. I need to do a little bit of backup for this subject. Side chaining means a lot of different things. It can mean a lot of different things to different people. Among other things, it's compression, but compression controlled from another source. But you can also use side chain and a gate. Doesn't have to be a compressor, or a dynamic EQ, or some multi-band compressors. You can also, in reason, take any signal and use it to control another quality or attribute of something, like the decay time on a reverb, so that, much like a dynamic EQ, you are adjusting parameters besides just volume. So ducking traditionally means volume. Let's do a little history. What was ducking? Where does it come from? It's I first knew about it from broadcast world, from my older brother, and it's what they would use to push the music down softer whenever the announcer spoke. I should have hooked it up for the music bed right now and then we could hear it, but I don't know how I would do it in this particular setup. But that was the idea, was by using the voice to control when the music got quiet. You could imagine it was like having a person sit there and automatically adjust the volume. In fact, let's do a quick example. Let me show you what compression is, basically. Since we're going to build on this, we're going to start with a patch here. This is Thor. All it does is this. Sorry, it clips a little there. I had it set up too high. Okay, so now imagine a compressor. So that's a signal that just gradually gets louder and then starts over and gradually gets louder. So now imagine you're telling the compressor, or me in this case, because I'm going to be the compressor, to not let it get louder. So it'll sound something like this. So I'm going to turn it down. Got pretty good at it earlier. So if I didn't do that, it would go and get louder. So the degree to which I respond could be similar to the attack and release time of a compressor. The degree to which I adjust it in response to the changes could be the ratio. If I try to hold it at the exact same spot, that's like an infinity to 1 ratio or a limiter. If I let it get louder still, but not as much louder before, it could be like a ratio in between, like a 2 to 1 or a 4 to 1 ratio. So basically, I'm listening to the signal. When it gets to be a certain loudness, I start to respond to it. And as it gets louder, I keep turning it down. And then when it stops and goes back to quiet, I turn the volume back up and wait for it to start over again. That's what a compressor does. In the case of a compressor, it's using the signal's level to determine how much to turn it down. So if it goes up 6 dB, it knows to turn it down 6 dB, at least for the ratio that would be the steepest or the sharpest, or infinity to 1 or 100 to 1 even comes close to that. And the way that it does it is it literally splits the signal into two and sends one of them through the volume device, which in this case is the master volume, and it sends the other one to the controller, and that's me in this case, and then the controller tells the volume to adjust according to what you set on the front panel. Now, imagine I put some sort of a filter on that signal and made it really bright. So now I'm going to turn it down. I'm going to be more sensitive to the brighter signals. I'm going to turn it down when it gets bright even more than when it's loud but not bright. The same thing if I made it so that I didn't hear as much low end, I might be inclined to turn it up more for even when a low end signal is present, because I'm not hearing as much. And that's what filtering on the side chain does. So let's now look at the concept of how do we know what to tell it? How do we know how loud the signal is? How do we measure the signal? That's an interesting thing that happens. We take a signal that's bipolar, positive and negative. Remember, a speaker starts in the center and goes in and out. So it's pushing and pulling, compressing and expanding the air. And that would normally be like a triangle wave like this. And then if we wanted to measure the volume, we would have positive and negative numbers as it goes up to whatever the highest is and down to the lowest. It's a positive number up above the dotted line and a negative number down below the dotted line, and that makes it tough to measure the volume. So we do something called rectification, where we flip the signs for the negatives and we leave the positives where they are. Now remember that polarity inversion is just flipping both the signs. So that would be taking this one and flipping this one upside down and sending it down like I just did. Rectification is kind of like half of that. Just the negatives get the sign removed, so that if it's, let's imagine this is 0 plus 1 at the top and minus 1. If that's 0, then here we are at 50%, then we're at 100%, then we're at 50%, then we're at 0, then we're at negative 50%, negative 100. So we take the negative off, and that turns it into a positive 50 and a positive 100. So we get waveforms that are all above 0, and then we do some attack and release smoothing on it, and it connects these pulses or peaks and gives us a constant level. Well, it's a constantly changing level too, but if we gave it a test tone, we would see the meter sit still at a constant level. And that's what we use to measure the loudness. So if we know that the signal is sitting at minus 10, for example, and the threshold then would come into play, because maybe the threshold's at minus 12 and we are 2 dB over the threshold, so we are starting to compress. Now, I know we didn't want to talk about compression today necessarily, but a lot of times we use compressors to pull off ducking techniques, and I'll show you those here in a minute. But the idea is that a compressor is ideally set up for this because it has the envelope detector that determines what the signal is. the level is, and then it adjusts itself. And we can use that same technique to create a ducking effect. So let's just look. Oh, I made a big mess in this one. I just kept adding to it. I was going to say, look at this and you'll understand what I'm talking about, but you won't, because I'm very out of control here with my organization. So what I did is I created a drum beat, and then I created a bass line. The drums in Kong, and it goes like this. Oh, it's soloed. Okay, we're trying to keep it simple here. The bass line is just going to go. There we go. I had to click on. Okay, so the bass is just kind of roaring along. Now, usually what we do, or what we want to do, is we want to have the bass duck, and this works on a pad too. We want to have the bass duck every time the kick drum hits. The theory being that you are trying to fit two big things into the same space, so there's only really room for one at a time. So by messing with the time domain, we can make it so that there's bass or there's kick drum, but not both. Oh my gosh. In the middle of that sentence, it just occurred to me I thought of another way to do side chaining that I hadn't even prepared for today. Crossfade side chaining. I will have to see if I can hook that up. Okay, so the history of sidechain ducking for the modern world, you know what? I didn't do my homework there. I don't know what the history. I don't remember who the first person was that really started doing that effect. And I'm not sure how much it was ducking or just filters opening up on the bass patch, because we can program that same effect easily into a synthesizer as long as it's doing the same rhythm over and over again. It's when it starts to have a pattern to the kick drum that's different than 4 on the floor or the same thing over and over again that it becomes something easier to do with a sidechain type technique. So very simply, what we would do is we would take the kick drum signal and split it. One of it goes to the channel like it normally does. The other goes to become the method that we will use to duck the bass sound. There's a bunch of ways you can do that. In Kong and in Redrum, they have sends on there. So right now I just put send 1 on 100, which is unity, meaning it's going to send out the kick drum at the same level that the main channel does. And that goes to a splitter. I'm sorry for this chaos too. Basically, the one we're concerned with right now is the mix channel. So Europa goes into this mix channel. Well, it goes through a bunch of stuff. Again, I could have made this simpler. But I wanted to have it all set up ahead of time for some crazy reason. So basically, the kick drum comes into the sidechain input, and the bass comes into the main input. That's all. That's the part you need to know. The bass into the main input will happen automatically. The only thing you need to patch is the kick drum coming into the sidechain input. Now, you can do this a lot of different ways. You can make a whole drum machine with a bass drum that is used, that you never hear it actually. It's just used to trigger things. And with some drum machine type plugins like the drum sequencer, you have a CV gate out or a trigger out, and we'll show you that too, which can also be used. So right now we're using an audio signal, and we're going to come into the mixer, and when we do this, you'll see, this is the mixer channel here. You'll see, let's see if I can zoom in. There we go. You'll see the key light is lit. That means something's plugged in and it's active. So now when we turn the compressor on, we will see, instead of it being compressed by the bass, it's going to respond to the kick drum. So it's going to pulse every quarter note. Now, we can solo the bass. And hear that familiar effect. Now, what is the settings that I used here? I'm using the highest ratio. I'm adjusting. The threshold is less important, but it can be, if you're wildly off, it can be very important. Because if you're too high, you won't get any ducking. As you lower it, you'll get just a little bit, and then you'll get a lot when we're down low. Release time, if it's too fast, it'll do this. Not a whole lot different still. But if you use a longer release, you can create a little gap. So it sounds like bop, bop, bop. So the upbeats, this being the downbeat, the offbeats or the upbeats are when the bass sound comes in. So the problem, if there is one, well, there's two problems. One which I didn't know about and one which I did. One is that you don't have a lot of control with mini compressors over that shape of when it goes down and when it comes back up. The benefit is the sound that you're sending to it, in this case the bass drum that we're hearing, is going to, the envelope of that bass drum is going to be used to duck the kick, so that if it's a short bass drum, it'll come back quicker. If it's a long bass drum, it might not come back at all, and you might have a problem with that. So if that's too, you can always shorten things, but then you're affecting your sound of the bass drum. And that's why some people will use a completely separate bass drum as the source, one that you're not hearing, one that's a set length, or one that you can control the length with the decay control. And that lets you shape the response of the ducking. For example, we can hear it. Let's see if we can exaggerate that. Now let's go into the kick drum here. And short kick drum. Longer kick drum. And there's a big gap because it's, for as long as the kick drum is hanging in there, it's ducking. So there's more ducking, less ducking, almost no ducking there actually. So that's how the length of the kick drum. Now let me let you hear that. That second kick drum up on this pad here isn't being fed to the ducker, so that doesn't have any effect on it. It doesn't get super long. It's a sample, so it only gets as long as the sample is. But that's how you can control the shape, basically, of the ducking curve when you're using a compressor. Now, that's one way to do it, but that gives you limited control. But that's the quickest way because it's already in every channel, and it just requires one cable connection and one button, and you're ducking. So now let's look at another way, which is to use something like an M-class compressor. And this will take a sidechain signal in as well. I've split it from the splitter here, so that's the same signal. I know, a mess. This sidechain signal here comes from the splitter, comes from the aux send. So it's just the kick drum, and this will be indicated here. We can actually solo the sidechain in this guy, so we can hear. So let's do the same thing. Let's play with the settings. More ratio means more depth. Okay, I know this is confusing because a lower threshold also means more ducking or more depth. But what's really happening with the threshold is we're getting kind of a time control as well. Whereas the longer the bass drum is above the threshold, the longer it will hold the ducking. And whereas the ratio is going to be how far it ducks. So it's like 4 dB of ducking there at 2 to 1. That's 12 dB, 8 to 1, or 5, where's that, 5 to 1. And we get close to 20 dB. Now let me show you something really quick here. A lot of times when you're doing this, hopefully that all made sense. I'm not even monitoring, I'm sorry guys, not monitoring the chat or anything. No chat questions yet. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing something. I'm so new to this still. This is my 10th live stream, but still I get lost in this screen and forget to check the other screen. I will now show an example of what we're doing to the levels. When we look at the kick drum, let's see, we gotta get this on so we can see this level. Okay, so the kick drum right now is hitting at -10. If we add the bass without any side chaining, ducking, we're going up 3 dB, maybe, yeah, going up 3 dB there, hotter. If we duck it, though, let's reset it. Now, we're not adding any more peak level. We've just gained 3 dB of headroom there just by ducking it. Obviously, as we turn the ratio down, we'll see the level go up. 9, it's up a dB, up 2 dB, up 3 dB. Now, depending on how we set this, if we use, let's see, we're gotta turn that on auto or keep resetting it. Let's use less of a threshold. Let's see how little we can get away with. So we maybe don't want to hear it, but we want to get the advantage of this peak reduction. All right, there's 9. So let's back down a little bit. Okay. Now we're getting enough ducking to not add to the peak level. Well, I got called out right there. I'm a liar. Let's go back. Somewhere in here. And that's only like a decibel hotter, so we're still going to get 2 dB more. And in some cases you can get even more. It depends on how loud each of these elements are next to each other. But we can hear now. That's what's going on there. Let's put it back to the extreme and let me show you another example. Okay, back to here. So we go to -7. Now we're going to compare that to using the... Now, for whatever reason, this one, even with this extreme of a setting, is still only giving us, now it popped over. So we're not getting any advantage with the channel compressor in the SSL. I have a feeling, in fact, it just got louder. I have a feeling it has to do with two things. One could be the timing, where we're just not fast enough to get the peak, the transient. The other could be the auto makeup gain on this compressor is messing with us so that we're not getting the advantage that we would think, because it often adds about 6 dB, 3 to 6 dB overall level with this compressor being on, and so that kind of defeats the purpose of the ducking. So if you want to be absolutely sure you're getting the full effect, it would appear it's better to use an external compressor like this. Now, there is yet another way to do it. Let me now jump ahead. This is a little bit a tougher one. All right, maybe I should do the crossfade last. Let me just mention, I'm not going to show an example of it, but let me just mention a similar technique, which is side chaining a gate, which may seem like, why would you do that? In the past, I have done it so that I can play a tremolo effect, if that makes sense. For example, I've done it before where the guitar player is playing power chords, and I'm playing like an organ patch, but not with a Leslie on it, just this most static, straight tone, like a sine wave would be perfect, or even a square or saw wave. So something without any detuning or beating. And every time I hold a key down, the gate opens, and you hear the guitar. So if I go pop, 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 pop on the keyboard, every time I'm playing a note, you're hearing guitar. Every time I'm not, you're not. And in the case that we were doing it way back when that was the only way to do it, we were wanting a tremolo effect that was synced with the music. And the guitar player, producer, wanted some variation. So he said, don't always play straight pattern. You can hold it down and let some parts go through, or you can not press a key for a beat or two and leave some holes. So it became an interactive. We both played at the same time as it was being recorded. It became an interactive performance and a way to turn one thing on when another thing plays. Now, ducking is doing the opposite. It's turning one thing off when another thing plays. So every time the bass drum hits, we turn the bass off. Or we turn it down. Let me show you. These are examples of, they're muted. This is the kick drum, this is the bass, and this one is the duct bass from the M-class compressor or the SSL. I don't recall which one. Just to show you that when you're using a compressor, you're not making silence at the front of the note where you're doing the ducking. You are just turning it down. And you can see that when this is done, this one is allowed to come back on, basically. Then as an alternate, I have one that's done with an envelope, which I'm going to show you next, where you can have absolute control, so you'll have silence in between and as long a gap as you want until the sound is allowed, or short as gap as you want, because you're drawing the shape instead of using the envelope of the kick drum to determine when it's ducking. That gives you more control, but it's probably best when you're wanting to hear the effect. When you don't want to hear it, you want to use the kick drum that's being used in the track, because that creates basically a hole puncher effect. It punches out the hole that's exactly the size of the kick drum. So it doesn't stay off for too long unless you have the release too high, which would mean it'll be slow to catch up after the kick's done. But otherwise, if you keep those times reasonable and the threshold reasonable, you can get it to be fairly transparent and not such an obvious over-the-top effect. Now, when you do want the obvious over-the-top effect, that's when you call in the sweeper. The sweeper is an unexpected tool for this job because this is a modulation effect, but it just happens to have a really fantastic envelope and envelope follower built in, which can be triggered by audio or triggered by an envelope. And that's what we're going to do first. We're going to take, let's see if I got this right, take the drum sequencer envelope. Let's get the screen here where we can see. This is the trigger, and we're going to send it here and send it on now over to here. So what I should see is, hello, this light here light up when I hit the button there. So hopefully, nope, yes. I thought maybe my picture was in the way, but you can see that. So now when this plays, we're getting the trigger here, and it's triggering the envelope. Now we're not hearing anything because the bass isn't playing, so and I just realized I have to unmute these tracks. Sorry, I'm getting double ducking going on. There we go. So now whatever pattern the kick drum plays, it will send triggers into sweeper, which is ducking. Now, how do you set up sweeper? You just start with the default setting and turn the dry wet knob all the way to dry, and then turn the mod knob all the way up to cause the modulation envelope to control volume. And that way, this shape, thanks to Daniel Exode on Reason Talk for pointing this out to me, if you do it this way, then this shape is like a synth envelope. And in fact, I did some other variations down here. Let's move the trigger over here so you can see there's creative applications too. This is one pattern that I like. And since we can sync this envelope, we know that this is a quarter note, so these are 16th notes, because there would be 4 of them. If we wanted to put another one in there, we could. We can do dynamic. You can adjust curves. I like that. All sorts of interesting patterns can be drawn that way, and that's essentially the same thing. You could call it ducking. In this case, it's not ducking based on the signal that's triggering it, which only comes every quarter note. It's ducking based on the pattern. So we're getting into kind of synchronous territory. I just find this easier to draw than synchronous because you don't have to draw all the points in between, and you have these wonderful curves. And you can play around. Now, you don't have quantizing on here, so you have to just remember that word audio is, the line under audio is the center, or the halfway point, or the 8th note in this case, if it's set to quarter note. And we can do all different timings here, and you can even loop this to get it to keep going after the trigger is done, and do very interesting things. But I'm trying to keep it relatively simple and cover all the variations. So back to this simple version here. Oh, no trigger yet. So now what if you wanted to use this trigger, but you didn't have the drum machine? What if you had, for example, the kick drum already recorded as an audio track from maybe somebody gave it to you, or you're using samples in a Rex file, or samples pasted into the timeline? What we're going to do instead is we're going to take it out of here. So the same kick drum signal from the aux in, so it's just the kick drum. See aux 1 here? I should be using my new zoom function. So the kick drum 1 is being sent to aux 1. Nobody else is being sent to aux 1. That way I can split the kick drum out on its own without having to assign it to a separate output. And that signal goes into a sweeper that is very simple. All I did was turn audio trigger on and adjust the threshold and left it in the middle, and then connected the trigger out to the next sweeper. So again, my setup looks a mess, but it's really, each thing I'm showing you is actually very simple. It's just 3 devices: a kick drum, a sweeper, and a bass, or in this case, 2 sweepers. One to generate the trigger and one to generate the ducking. But you can see we got the same effect. We're just not using the trigger out from here anymore. Right? All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit more advanced mode. Basically, you need, let me just recap before I go off the deep end, because we've been playing more in the shallow end. The messy shallow end, but the shallow end. You basically need to take your signal that is being ducked, the bass in this case, this could also be a pad, and run it through something that can control volume. And a compressor can control volume. Okay, so that's a good start. But the sweeper can also modulate volume with this part here. And then you have to trigger it from some other source. In this case, the bass drum is our trigger. And usually the only tricky part is figuring out how to split it. Now we can use a send as well. We're using a send in the Kong, but we could use a send in the mixer and then take the output of that send and connect into the sidechain input of a compressor or into a sweeper to use as a sidechain, as a trigger generator, to use another sweeper to sidechain it. I could close up a few things, I guess, and make it a little simpler. So you've got to just have those three things. You've got to split the kick signal and send it to something that can control the gain, and then run the bass through that, or the pad through that thing that can control the gain. You're basically doing auto gain control from one source from a different destination. I hope that's clear, and it's one of those things that once you understand it, you may never have had to explain it before, so it kind of can trip you up. Like, how do I explain that? Wait, I've never had to explain it. I understand it, but I can't explain it. So I'm hopefully going to say something in the course of the hour that clicks for somebody who is still struggling to understand the concept, or at least shows you the basic way to get started and to start experimenting with it yourself. Now, there's another way that, gosh, I thought of this earlier and I didn't write it down. I am not good at taking notes. I'm not going to demonstrate this one because I think it's obvious. Well, maybe I could do a very quick version of it. Another way is to do automation. And that's going to be a little more time consuming, but let's see. If I use shift there. All right, so actually we want all of these to be 734. Oh, Reason and your crazy, wacky numbering system for volume automation. Okay, so I didn't put one there. Let's see. Oh, I'm doing this wrong. But I can fix it. I can make it work. Not quite. I could actually grab all of these and move them over. And we have these curves, just like in Sweeper. Now the problem with this is, since I'm not triggering it, if the pattern changes, I have to draw a different pattern. Since I'm looping one bar here, I only had to draw one bar. But if I want this to go out the whole song, I've got to copy and paste. And every copy and paste, there's usually going to be 2 little automation points at the transition, and you'll be pulling your hair out. This gives you absolutely the most control because it can change over time, and every duck can be individually hand-drawn. It's the boutique version. So that's a way to do, another way to do the ducking. And finally, while we're still on the same general subject, we have send ducking. Let's turn it back to how it was. And in this example, I'm going to take the bass and send it at 0 dB unity out send 1. Let's go over here and look at what I've actually got patched now. Send 1 goes over into this sweeper here, and I'm just using a trigger here like we did on the other sweeper. And then it returns on return 1. The important part is we invert the polarity of that signal. And I'm using SeligAudio for that. Thor can work for that. There's other things that can work for that. And basically, when the signal is, if I were to bypass this, when we're sending it, it's going to cancel. Now, we're actually sending it right now, but you don't hear it because it's canceling. as soon as I invert it. If we send less to it, it'll cancel less. So if we actually start playing this curve, when this is down, there's no cancellation because it's only the original by itself. When this is up, we are sending an polarity inverted version, which cancels. So the closer we get to all the way up, the more it comes to canceling. Now, the advantage of this is I can send something else to it as well. I don't have to just use one thing. And I can send different amounts, so I don't have to have it. Let's do something that will just play a note on its own. Okay, now this annoying sound. Now we're ducking that too. As you probably heard as I was turning it up, that's less ducking. Less ducking. The most ducking is when this is right at 0. Right? If I go over 0, it'll start coming back around. So you don't want to go over 0. And that's it. Now you can send anything you want. You can send anything you want to that bus 1, or send 1, and it will duck. I feel like the guy on Forged in Fire. It will duck. Will it duck? Yes. It will kill. Now we have one more thing I want to show you. Let me, oh my gosh, people are talking. I'm so not used to this job. Okay, I'm going to pause before I go off the even deeper end and catch up. Somebody says using a click to instead of a kick to trigger the compressor. Yeah, a click is great. It's going to be the shortest sound, and you have to use a longer release time when you're using a click to trigger. But it works great. Technically, it is technically a synced pattern gate. Yes, what I was doing with the sweeper is a synced pattern gate. Philip, basic question. I wonder, how is the sweeper affecting the signal there? Would it not in a niche patch be doing something to your signal? Yes, it'll be phase shifting the signal in the init patch. So the important thing when using sweeper is this knob right here. Turn the dry wet all the way to dry, because we don't want to do sweeping with the effect named the sweeper. I know, that's crazy. But this has such a good envelope follower and trigger and envelope drawing system that I love using it in Reason. It's the best thing for the job that's not specifically a tool designed to do the job. Yes, okay, I see you got that. Is there a way to recap? Yes, this will be online, so if you want to watch it in its entirety at your leisure and rewind and watch things over, you can do that. But recapping, I showed the SSL channel compressor being used to duck. Its issue seemed to be that it didn't give you any advantage with headroom because it didn't duck enough, or its auto gain caused problems, auto makeup gain, so that it actually peaked higher in some cases than the original signal. So the idea when you're ducking is you're trying to make some headroom by not having the kick and the bass play at the same time. But you have to get that all set up right, or it'll do like that and you'll actually make it higher peak, possibly. It only did that once, and I haven't thoroughly tested it. But I did find that the M-class compressor did allow us to see a headroom gain, meaning we didn't add headroom when the bass and kick played together, because they never actually play together when the ducking is working correctly, if that makes sense. And that leads us to the last technique, which is a little trickier, and it's going to break everything I've got here. So let me just try to explain it as I set it up. We need a, oh gosh, where am I? Utilities. Oh, maybe it's a utility. Yep, Groovy Melon. Morphin Crossfader. Morphin, what's it called? Morphin XF. This was way back. This was an early release. It's still I think the best crossfader out there. So what am I doing with a crossfader, and why did I put it on the bass? I don't know. Let's pull it out of there and disconnect it so it's not connected to anything. I've got key commands doing that, by the way. It's basically the disconnect device that I just used to unhook it. So with a crossfader, you're either an A or both or B. Let us connect this, and then let me see if I can make it work. Okay, the signal that I was sending to the side chain, I'm going to send to A. I haven't done this for a while, so I hope I do this right. And then the signal that we want to duck, that's the bass, I'm going to send it into B, and I'm going to disconnect it from where it was before. Oh, it's 1 and 2 right there. You assign them to A and B on the front. All right, so now let's put a mix channel in, and hello. Take the outputs into here. All right, so now soloist. Here's my bass. Here's my kick. So now what's the trick? The trick is to use a CV signal to do the modulation. We just happen to have one coming from one of these sweepers. Okay, so let me see. Okay, that one's being triggered. This shape now will be available on the envelope follower output. So this signal, hang on, becomes our control signal, and it's going to control the fader, basically. And I can't remember if I got it right or not, but let's see what happens. There it is. So now, doesn't sound a whole lot different. What's going on here? Well, first of all, let's check out our level. Okay. I don't have a way to turn that off, do I? So I've got to unconnect it first. Second. Okay, so there's the kick drum. It's a little hotter than it should have been. I don't know why it got louder. Again, I haven't done this setup for a while, so let's just pull this down and get some levels that we can see here. Let's pretend this was at -10. There it is, close. Okay, and I'm looking over here, by the way. This is on the output. SeligAudio showing me the peak level. Then, where's the bass? Set it to the same level. All right. Now, normally, if they played together, they would add up. Oh, I can't remember. It will matter here. If we're doing a linear taper, now wait a minute. Which one is the one? There's one that leaves it on all the way. That's not it, because it'll be louder too. I used to know where all of these were. Constant power, squared, gentle taper, type A, B, dip, transition. This is the right one. So in this case, when you're in the middle, kick and bass are not dipped. Like a normal crossfader starts as you're going from A to B, turning down A and turning up B equally. In this case, A stays the same until you get to the halfway point, and then, you know, B's coming up. And then from the 50% point on, A gets softer and B doesn't move. So when you're in the middle, they're both 100%, meaning that if one was -10 and the other was -10, they're going to add up to something greater than -10. In this case, -6. So this is the problem we're trying to solve, which is when bass and kick play together, they get louder overall. But if we could duck them, then they wouldn't. And that's exactly what we're going to do. The advantage of the crossfader is that it's impossible, once I get it set up right, for it to ever be louder than the original, because, isn't that the right one? Hey, come on. Because it can never be louder. So we'll go back to the original constant power, which even in the middle position, you can see we're still at -10 or -9 or 11. It's kind of going all around there. Depends on the curve, but we're not even going to care because we're not going to be in the middle. And watch what happens now. Okay, so we have this curve. We're still, no matter where we go, we're not going to go over that. We're bumping over a little bit because our levels are probably too hot. So even if we change this curve, it'll never go over -10 because you can never have both of them on at the same time with a crossfader. So it's an ideal solution, but here's the downside. There's always a downside. There's probably a more complicated way to make this work. But when you do this, you end up with the kick and the bass drum coming out one channel together, and they're no longer separate. So you would have to do 2 of these with the same signals going through both, and then they could each have their own channel. And we have a time, so let's get to work. We have to send the same CV to both, so we need a CV splitter. And we're going to do that here, there to there. And then we need to send them to the same inputs we were using. But now, and that shouldn't necessarily be in there, it matters. Now we need another one for this output. This should solve that problem. Let's see if I get lucky. Yep. Yep. Now the other difference is, obviously, since the crossfader is we're not seeing it move because it's a control voltage, but because it's moving away from the kick, we're going to see or hear the kick get shortened a little, and we can use these different curve types to keep that from happening to some degree. No, doesn't really matter. Thought that would be a bigger difference, but it's not. But that's how you would use a crossfader to then get the signals to not be separate. And that's not, I mean, there's probably even more ways to do the same thing than I've covered here. Any of these techniques can be made a send-based technique like I showed you earlier over here with this guy, just by inverting the polarity before you return it back into the return. So to recap that, send 1 goes over to the sweeper, then the sweeper goes to SeligAudio, gets inverted and comes back into return 1. Since that is delay compensated, there's no latency that we have to worry about. You could use a channel for the return and then flip the polarity there. I believe that would work. There might be 1 batch or 64 samples delay doing it that way. I don't know if that would matter. We have 5 minutes. Do you want to find out? I do. I'm curious. So we'll come over here and we'll make another mix channel. And instead of going back into the return, we'll come over to this one now. I have to undo all of this crazy stuff over here. This is what a typical day messing around looks like for me, by the way. The Reason is just getting crazier and crazier and crazier as I add more and more and more stuff. This is also, by the way, I forgot to mention this. I probably left this on too. So it's also a great way to use the off button on these things. Okay, now we got to get things restored. Our chain doesn't go to the right place anymore. So hang on. Let's come out of here into there and get rid of that. And now we'll send that to bus 1. And this is why you want to use off instead of bypass. If I use bypass, it's going to get louder because I'm sending it to this, but I'm not doing anything. So I'm just adding two things together. That gets 6 dB louder. Off gets rid of that secondary signal. Okay, so actually I did something wrong. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Okay, hang on. We gotta do one more thing. I'm skipping SeligAudio to try to show how this would work by using a channel and a inversion here, but I've got it so complicated. I don't think my levels are right. Something ain't right. That's inverted. It could be the delay that's going to make this not work. I think that's exactly what's going on. Okay. When you have a short, so scrap that idea unless, let's see if delay compensation is smart enough to fix this. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? Not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is because Reason does not want to create a direct feedback loop. So they put the delay there anytime you patch from a send to a device and back into a mix channel. That is keeping us from being able to cancel it perfectly. So that unfortunately won't work for this. And that's sad because that is such a handy way to work in an analog mixer to bring your effects back into the main channels, and then you can add effects to the effects. You can put reverb on the delay, so that when the vocal throws into a delay and the repeats aren't dry, they all have some reverb or different reverb. Lots of ways to use that, but apparently we're not going to be able to use it here. So let me make sure I've covered everything. You can do ducking by using the envelope of the original signal, or you can try to get a trigger either from the drum machine or from Sweeper or other devices that can create a trigger from an audio signal, and then use that to trigger an envelope and do, what did Philip O call it? Gated something something. And you can use automation, and those are about the main ways I'm aware of how to do ducking. And then from there you can build on it by using a send-based system if you need to duck several things at varying amounts. They don't all have to be 100% ducking. And automation being the most flexible system is also the most time-consuming one to set up. I think the quickest way to do simple ducking is to use an M-class compressor, although, and I should check this out, we didn't find that the built-in channel compressor worked very well, but I wonder if the rack extension channel dynamics would work. All right, so this is going to unfortunately take a second. This will be the last thing I do. Look at, there we go. I need to be able to get into that. Let's go into from there and then out. We can just come out of here into a mixed channel. For simplicity, I'll just create a new one. There we go. The question was it going to give us any advantage? So let's see what this alone is. Okay, -10, and then we add the bass. Yeah, it's going up to -6. Okay, let's compare that quickly with, I have to either run another one of these over to this one and then compare it to this one. Yep, and I don't know what it is. Okay, I'm gonna blame it on the SSL makeup gain. That doesn't allow you to actually gain any headroom. So everybody, I guess the takeaway from this today is that the SSL channel dynamics is not the ideal way to do ducking when you're trying to get some headroom and prevent the two signals from playing at the same time and adding up to 6 dB, usually 3 to 6 dB to the total. So even the M class is better, surprisingly, although I love the sound of this compressor, the channel compressor, more than the sound of the M class. The M class is still holding up all these years later as a technical tool to use as an envelope follower and take the CV out, which is also handy to do here if you want to create something that does ducking for you, or just using the sidechain input and using it to create the ducking effect to keep your levels under control when bass and kick play together. So a lot to digest. I hope I've covered everything in some way that makes sense. I tried to say it many times so that one of them would at least be something that somebody could relate to. I see more comments here. Bass and kick together and techno, yes. Oh, I like that, Mark. I'm sorry for dead air here. Mark Talton is talking about another effect. Obviously, any of these effects that use a trigger can be turned into pattern effects because you can create a different pattern. I can create a pattern on the drum sequencer player that just uses the trigger output and doesn't actually fire a sound. I don't by setting it to a key that's not one of the samples loaded into Kong or whatever drum machine you're using. So it can become a very interesting generator. In fact, you could then populate this with, for example, 3 different patterns going on and then send them to something like Alligator and essentially gate different parts of the spectrum at different times and create textural, timbral variations as well. Once you understand the basics, which was the goal of this live stream, you can begin to apply these same techniques to many different things. For example, if we use a vocal instead of a kick drum and a reverb instead of a bass, we can use the vocal to duck the level of the reverb. And obviously I've already covered a dynamic reverb, which we use the vocal level to control the decay time of the reverb or the feedback time of a delay. And when you combine those two together, you can get almost, it sounds like you've automated things, because every time the singer stops, you'll hear the reverb bloom, or you'll hear the delay repeat, as well as the level go up to fill the gap. And it can really make your mixing a lot easier and a lot quicker to do those types of things. Doesn't always work, but when it does, it's like magic. Like many things in audio. They don't always work, but when they do, when you find the right technique or tool for the job, it's always a pleasure when you finally, especially if you've looked for other solutions. As you can see, every solution has its advantages and disadvantages, and some don't quite give us what we would expect, like the channel dynamics don't quite give us the headroom we would expect. So if it's not sounding the way you want it to, try something different. There's no rules really, but these are the basics, and we will leave it at that. Pump up the music. Oh, I forgot to point out that my studio is changing once again, and the next live stream will be even more changed. My Zoom mixer is retired and only for live use, and I don't know if you can't see it. The old Midas mixer, the M32R, which is an amazing mixer with effects and everything, is now my synth mixer, because it can feed light pipe over to the Apollo interfaces. So I have 32 channels coming in now. Instead of having to switch between the USB interface from the mixer or the USB interface on the Zoom mixer, which was the synths, I now have everything coming in at once. Let me share this console. Oh, this isn't the right console. This is just the drum tracking. Unfortunately, this would interrupt the audio if I reloaded the console, but I have 32 channels coming in now at once with no switching between. I can record all my synths separately at once into Reason or Luna, and I have the ability to add effects over there. And also something that I would miss from the Zoom if the Midas didn't have it too, which is putting a USB stick in and being able to record, because you don't always have your DAW booted when ideas spring, and I've captured, by being able to do that, more ideas in a short amount of time than I think I have ever before. And it's a nice thing to be able to have the setup that provides me with the goal of the studio, which was to have everything connected. I've got a drum kit, I've got a guitar amp, I've got a vocal mic, I've got a percussion mic and a percussion table that I can wheel around, I've got V drums, and everything has a channel that's live on demand. Just gotta go punch a few buttons, and it's now I guess it's up to me to make some music, because I've been getting it all set up. But by the time you see me next, my new computer will be integrated. I got it this week, but I didn't want to switch over in the middle of a live stream because it's an M1 Studio Max, and of course there will be some growing pains because not everything is M1 compatible yet. And I've been doing a complete fresh rebuild instead of a migration assistant upgrade. It's replacing my 2014 iMac, which we're using now. 8 years is way more than I usually get out of a system, but I've been very happy with this. About the only thing that's happened is the screen is a little bit slow, and if I've left it on one screen for a while, you won't ever see it here because this is HDMI out, but on the screen I can still see some of the, the bleed through. Not bad right now, but it's ready to be retired. And I'm really pushing it with some mixes lately, and I have to export the mix to really hear it clean without glitches. So the timing's good. Next month I'll be telling you some stories, hopefully good, about my new toy. Until then, go make some music.